Hello everyone, and welcome to this new webinar of the Yes We Trust community. Let's wait for 1 or 2 minutes for everyone to join, and we'll get started. Great. Welcome again, everyone. We have a very interesting topic today and great speakers who are joining me. We'll talk today about Google Analytics 4 and how to stay compliant with GA4 as well as growing your business. Obviously, like, it's a bit provocative because we know that that's the main challenge that many of you are currently facing. I think today we'll mainly talk and discuss trade-offs because that's what it is about. But before we get started, let me just present again the Yes We Trust community for those of you who are joining us for the first time. So Yes We Trust is an open community for everyone interested in privacy and wanting to go deep in privacy topics that sometimes make the headlines, but most of the times are deeply impacting your daily professional lives. And I think GA4 is one of these topics that is creating a lot of questions and challenges for organizations. So we thought it would be an interesting topic to bring up to the community. Our approach there is to be neutral. So we are not promoters of Google in any ways. We have like personal opinions, but I think there today the goal is for you to get a broad perspective on what is at stake when you move to GA4 or decide to move to GA4. How to best deal with all the challenges you're facing. And today, to address these interesting questions, I'm joined by two experts on the topic from our partner Jellyfish. First, Gabriel, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. My name is Gabriel. I'm a data and analytics director at Jellyfish. I've been working there for 8 years, and I'm basically working within the French tracking team. And as you can guess, I've done a lot of GA4 migration, so I hope this event will be really helpful for you.
Thank you, Gabriel. And we are also very lucky to have Adrien, who's bringing us the compliance perspective to the question. Hello, Adrien.
Hi, Romain. Thank you very much. Yeah, so hi, everybody. I'm Adrien Hochkolder. I'm based in Paris, and I'm the Group Data Protection Officer for Jellyfish, which means that I am essentially responsible for our own compliance with applicable data protection and privacy laws throughout our group, which expands over 25 countries, 40 plus entities. And I'm also coordinating much of our efforts when it comes to helping our clients with privacy. Really happy to be here.
Thank you, Adrien. And yes, an interesting perspective to the question, as you're yourself a data protection officer, so facing directly these questions for your group, which is always interesting. And I'm Romain Gauthier, founder and CEO of Didomi, and I'll animate and host this panel today. We have a pretty dense agenda. Before we deep dive, we have two polls that we'd like you to possibly answer if you agree, just to help everyone understand where they stand compared to the audience. So first question, which is, have you already migrated to Google Analytics 4? And second question, are you considering switching from GA to another solution? I think it will bring an interesting perspective to this agenda. So please, take 2 minutes to answer these polls if you'd like. It's on the right side of your screen under the polls section. Also, it's an opportunity for me to remind that Yes We Trust is a community, so we've prepared some material and content to bring you interesting perspective to these questions. But obviously, we'd like you to contribute. So if you have questions, if you think about also interesting sources that you want to share with the community, please feel free to do so in the question section as well as in the chat. It's open, and as you see, we'll end the session by answering as many of these questions as we can. So please feel free to contribute as well. It's how we can all make progress on these complex questions. Great. So the agenda today is the following. So we'll discuss. It's a bit provocative as well. If Google Analytics is indeed illegal in Europe, the challenges coming with GA4 migration, and how to ensure this successful migration. We'll focus a bit on GA4 compliance. Thereafter, how to configure it, what are the trade-offs there, and we'll end with I think a broader perspective on the question, which is around server-side tracking. What are the benefits? What are the consequences of adopting this type of architecture from a governance, from a privacy and a business standpoint? So pretty interesting agenda, hopefully, and we'll get started right away. Let me see if we have the polls results already. If not, we'll take another couple minutes. Let's see. Okay,
Yeah, we have a few votes already. Like 21 people have voted, which is great.
Great. So it's moving. So we'll keep monitoring the results. Thank you all for answering. Let's get started. So let's deep dive in the first important question, and not easy one, which is Google Analytics illegal in the EU? Adrien, it's on you to help us address this complex question. Thank you.
Thanks, Roman. Yeah, you're right. That is a provocative, question, but it's not as provocative as the first draft we had, which was why is Google Analytics illegal in the EU? We try to really reel people into this one, but before really answering that question, let's start by giving people a bit of context as to why we're here today and why we're asking ourselves that question. So, going back to actually July of 2020, on the 16th of July of 2020, the European Commission, or the Court of Justice of the European Union, invalidated the Privacy Shield, which was a data transfer mechanism between the EU and the US, and it was actually a self-certification mechanism, which meant that it was not necessarily very robust in terms of controls and making sure that there was strong safeguards. There were strong safeguards in place in terms of data protection. And that was the reason why it got invalidated. There actually was a first instance even before that called the Safe Harbor, which had suffered the same fate at some point. And just following that decision, the nonprofit called None of Your Business, or NOID for short, filed a series of 101 complaints with authorities all around the EEA about the use of Google Analytics and Facebook Connect by website operators in the EU. And the funny thing is, actually, there's 51 about Facebook or Meta now, and 50 about Google, but we've only heard about Google and Google Analytics. Following this, there's been a almost 2 year or a year and a half time frame in which we didn't really hear much about this. But in that time, authorities all around the EU and the EA have worked together to try and find a common approach and a common response to this batch of complaints. And this has started in January of 2022, last year, with the Austrian DPA releasing a decision regarding the use of Google Analytics in stating that it might violate the EU GDPR. Then a number of other data protection authorities have followed suit, including the CNIL in France. And they've also ended up creating a fact check and sharing a fact check about GA, which was kind of referred to by a number of other authorities in the EU as well. And in the meantime, there were other discussions between the European Commission and the US administration to try to find a replacement to the Privacy Shield. And while all of that was happening, so we had the DPA on the one hand, political decisions and discussions on the other, and then a third player, obviously Google, has made has informed people and clients that Google Universal Analytics would go away, would be sunsets, and that people would have to migrate to GA4 anyway. So that's a lot of information to take into account, but just to give you an idea of why we're here and to respond to that question, is GA4 non-compliant and illegal in the EU? Well, the answer is no. GA and GA4 specifically is not illegal in the EU because there is a way for companies to implement GA, including Universal Analytics, in a way that is GDPR compliant. And I think Romain is going to talk a little bit more about this down the line. And here is why still we've had these decisions since the beginning of last year in the EU. It's because following the invalidation of the Privacy Shield, there was no more valid way to transfer data between the EU and the US, or at least not under the Privacy Shield, which was by far the preferred option for most international groups, including Google. Then EU companies were left pretty much with only the European Commission's standard contractual clauses, or SCCs, to transfer data over to third parties in the US. That's not exactly true. There's a bunch of other possibilities. You could rely on user consent. You could rely on binding corporate rules, and that's third parties within your group. But these are very, very limited instances. And considering consent, for instance, DPAs have stated that that would probably not be sufficient in the case of Google Analytics. So to sum things up, let's say, and to simplify all of this, let's say you only had SCCs to rely on. And this is what Google did. Essentially, they implemented the SCCs within their Google Ads data processing terms. And so all transfers of data, potential transfers of data, implied by the use of GA by European clients, were governed by the standard contractual clauses or model contractual clauses within the Google Ads data processing terms at that point. But in the decision that invalidated the Privacy Shield, the Court of Justice also mentioned that we needed to implement additional safeguards alongside the SCCs to make them applicable, and especially when the local law from the party that was receiving the data was not necessarily at the same kind of level as the GDPR in terms of protecting and safeguarding personal data from users in the EU. And that's kind of the issue, really. The data protection agencies or authorities determined that the additional safeguards implemented by Google, just because of the US surveillance laws, were not sufficient to prevent US surveillance agencies from accessing potentially EU data. And that's pretty much the entire situation. There is no way to transfer data over to the US except for the SCCs, but the SCCs are pretty much not sufficient to allow for transfers of data between the EU and the US. And so where are we now? Because that was a while ago, even last year, that seems like a lifetime ago. Well, right now, the EU and the US are still actively working towards a new EU to US data transfer framework. It's not been enacted yet. It's still very much in the news. We've had decisions and publications from several bodies recently that gave their point of view on this framework, and we're still not there yet. And so the issue is that until this political situation is enacted, because this is really a political situation, a political solution, Google itself is not going to be able to find a solution, clients either. It has to be a political solution. And so until that political solution is enacted, pretty much all US-based solutions are potentially impacted. It's not just GA, it's pretty much any company that transfers data over to the US. Okay, another question. So we've mentioned GA up until this point, but are the CLIA decisions or other DBA's decisions applicable to GA4 specifically? And to put it simply, the answer is no, because the decisions were really about this batch of 101, or rather, the 50 that were related to GA, but that batch of complaints by none of your business, that non-profit, and all of those related to the use of universal analytics. And so there is no decision, even today, that applies specifically to GA4. GA4 is a separate tool from universal analytics, and on top of that, it introduces additional privacy controls. Google, considering that they were going to be sunsetting universal analytics anyway, decided to really put all of their efforts into GA4, and that meant both from a product perspective in terms of feature, but also in terms of privacy controls. So there's a bunch of additional privacy controls, which Gabrielle is going to be presenting to you right after I'm done talking. And these are two different tools, essentially. So the decision against universal analytics cannot be directly translated and applied to GA4. But that said, Google is still a US-based organization, right? Alphabet is still incorporated in the US. So some aspects of decisions that led to these decisions will potentially still be applicable to GA4 as it would to every single US-based solution. All right, so Gabrielle, over to you to share with us what those new Google Analytics privacy controls are in GA4.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Sorry, let me go next. So to give you more details about the privacy controls, so what it is first, so the privacy controls are features that will that are available and allow you to have a better control over your data and over what's going on. So it allows the customer to govern how the data is collected, stored, and used. You can adjust this at any point of time because this is available inside the administration interface of GA4. There are plenty of privacy controls. We get a bit more detail later, but so to give you like the four main categories, so they are data collection, data usage, data storage, and data deletion. So for data collection here, I'll give you a couple examples for each one of the categories. So for data collection, you have, for instance, the granular location and device data. So this is something with the privacy control that you can just turn on and off if you want. Again, all of this is available inside the interface, the administration interface of GA4 at the property level. Obviously, we'll talk about the trade-off a bit later, because if you turn off some feature, you will have less information. But so you have the granular location and device data. This gives you information about the devices, the browser, and the location, like the city that I mentioned, like the city of the user. For the data usage, you have Google Signals and ad personalization. A bit more details about Google Signals, because you probably heard a lot about it recently. So this gives you information about the user that signed into their Google account. This is used a lot in GA4, so this is used obviously for the remarketing, the cross-devices remarketing. It's also used to identify the user, to give you more information about the interest and the demographics about the user. And so, as I was saying, to identify them, because inside GA4 you have different type of reporting identity, and you have still the client ID, which is dropped by Google. You have the user ID, but also Google Signals is used to identify the user and to identify the user across devices and cross sessions. For the data storage, you have some example would be the data retention. This is something as well inside the interface. So this is something you can set up to 2 or 14 months for the free clients, and up to 50 months for the 360 clients. The idea behind this is that once the data retention period is over, the data will be removed. So event level and user level data will be removed. The impact of that is that there should not be an impact inside the standard reports that you have inside GA4, according to Google. These reports are using aggregated data, so you should still be able, once the period is done, you should still be able to use the default report with primary, secondary dimension, even filter like that you have at the top of the interface, but this will impact the exploration report that you can build yourself. And for the last category, so it's data deletion. So you have the data deletion request that you can use inside the interface to request the deletion of data. And you have the user deletion API that's also available to remove data from specific users. In April 2022, Google added a bit more information, a bit more context about like the IP addresses, the regional data collection, and they added a new feature that was the regional controls that we're going to talk about. So for the IP addresses, Google specified that they don't log or store individual IP addresses. The IP addresses collected from the user in the EU, they are dropped before logging the data via the EU domain and servers. Regarding the regional data collection, so they are again just specifying that GA4 collects the data from EU-based devices through domains and servers based in the EU as well before they forward the traffic to analytics for processing. So this is just a bit of context that Google added, so it's also available online. And the new feature that's now available is the regional control. So it's available for Google signals and granular location and device data that I mentioned a bit earlier. So you can turn on and off this feature, but more specifically, you have now a panel on the right of your screen inside the interface in GA4 in the administration, so you can enable or disable them with a per region basis. So this gives you again a bit more control. And so the aim of the privacy data controls is to, as we always say, to mitigate the risk. It's not enough. You cannot say you are compliant just because you turned off a couple toggle buttons. But this is a first step that first Google allows you to have more control over your data. Some privacy controls, so this is up to you to know what you're going to turn on and off. But some privacy controls have a low impact, and some of them obviously come with trade-off. So not all the privacy controls have the same impact. To give you a couple of examples, so for instance, the user deletion request has very low impact or no impact at all. The disabling granular location and device data collection, it has medium impact, we could say, because you're going to lose a couple of dimensions inside GA4, but it should not be a big deal to analyze the performance of your user and your website. And Google Signals has a higher impact because, as we mentioned, it was pretty central inside GA4, so it's used for identifying the user. It will also impact like the sharing information with other Google solutions, so for the remarketing, for instance, and especially the cross-device remarketing. And now we can have a look at the alternatives for GA4. So I think this is for Adrian.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so yeah, we were thinking, we talked about how the decisions from all the data protection authorities were about Google Universal Analytics. And so now we have to think, okay, if I have to move away from UA, what are my options, right? And so we have kind of three main scenarios. The first one would be focusing on privacy, which is kind of moving to what we'd call it a sovereign stack, right? So that would be like using Piwik Pro, Tag Commander, for instance. So EU-based solutions, really audience measurement solutions. And so these are great solutions for audience measurements, and you have some really great pros, which would be risking or limiting the risks on data transfers to a maximum. And if you're in France, also, or if you happen to make some business in France, this could potentially be exempt from consent. So you would be able to obtain audience measurements insights without having to obtain user consent first. But in terms of cons, there's also, when compared to GA or Universal Analytics, lots of cons. The biggest being that you're going to be losing a lot of your capabilities in terms of marketing, in terms of data sharing and integration within your ad tech stack, martech stack, for instance. And also, there's one thing that you have to keep in mind if you're thinking of moving away to another solution really different from UA altogether and focusing on audience measurements solely. It's that the transition is potentially time-consuming and costly, and also that around on the market overall, there's way fewer resources available. And by that I mean that if you go to any agency and you ask them for help with your GA, Universal Analytics, or even GA4 now implementation, they will have dozens, if not hundreds, of consultants available to help you. If you're talking specifically about the likes of Pivot Pro, Piano Analytics, etc., there's going to be maybe 12 consultants in each agency. That's just because of the way the market is at the moment. So this might shift, as time goes, but this is something that you would have to keep in mind when considering whether you want to move away and migrate to another solution. So the other potentially possible option is to focus solely on marketing performance while deciding to move away from Universal Analytics and even moving away from Google altogether. That's potentially, a possibility. You would think Google is being targeted by the authorities. I want to move away from Google, but I want to retain some of my marketing and data sharing and integration capabilities. And that's possible if you were to move to Adobe or Segment, for instance, which are fairly similar to Google Universal Analytics in terms of capabilities. And so that's the biggest pro, right? Moving to Adobe or Segment means that you're going to have very similar capabilities in terms of marketing. But there are huge cons as well. The first one being that those solutions are almost exclusively US-based as well. So we mentioned that the actual issue is the potential transfer of personal data from the EU to the US, and moving to Adobe or Segment from Google doesn't really solve anything, does it? And also, obviously, the fact that you have to move away from Google and migrate to another solution is potentially, once again, time-consuming and costly in terms of migration. So what's the third option? Well, the third option, to move away from Universal Analytics, trying to find a way to focus still on marketing performance or retain as much capabilities as possible in terms of marketing and data integration, while improving in terms of safeguards and data protection, is to migrate to GA4. The pros are that you have very similar features to Google and Universal Analytics, that you have additional privacy controls, and that there's obviously out of the three options, that would be the smoother transition. But obviously, in terms of cons, the same thing as I've mentioned for Adobe and Segment would apply. Google is still a US-based company, and all US persons will have to comply with US surveillance laws. So it implies a trade-off between marketing performance and compliance. But the good news is there are definitely ways to use GA4 and to implement GA4 in a way that is compliant with applicable data protection laws. And this is what Romain is going to be talking to you about.
Thank you, Adrien. Yes, so I think when we look at alternatives, we end up seeing that, okay, if I want to be compliant and still be using GA4, what should I be doing? Fortunately, we received fairly precise guidelines on that by the CNIL in particular. And the key idea there is the idea of using a proxy. So ensuring that before the data goes in the US, you have control on the server, on the proxy server that would act as an intermediary between the user and any US server, and on which you could apply some rules that would respect a number of DPA criteria. So that's what we're going to look at right now. Proxy is a possible solution. So the CNIL was pretty specific about how it should be implemented if we want to achieve compliance. Obviously, so this schema illustrates what is exactly a proxy. So before like sending over data to any server, you have the data land on the first proxy server, on which you can apply a number of processing to pseudonymize, anonymize, remove, redact data in order to achieve compliance. That's exactly what Nicola is asking us, how to move forward with this proxy solution. So what are the criteria according to the CNIL? There are like a number of criteria to respect in order to achieve compliance. The first and most challenging one so far was the transfer of the IP address, which was complex, if not impossible before, and which I think GA4 addresses in a number of ways. We'll look at that in a bit more specific terms right after. Anything related to user identification needs to be like replaced or redacted by the proxy server, so to avoid any sort of tracking that wouldn't be under the control of the data controller, so the operator of the website. Some like more some rules that are a bit obscure, I guess, for a lot of us. So information about the referrer. Again, I think what the CNIL has in sight is the idea of fingerprinting. So any sort of information that you can collect from a user can be used to build some form of profile or fingerprint, and therefore any type of data has entropy and therefore augments the risk of fingerprinting. So proxy server is needs to be specifically configured in order to avoid this sort of risk. Same for a lot of the rules that are just below the user agent, for instance, any sort of cross-device or cross-site identifier, and basically any data that could lead to re-identification. So the list is pretty long and extensive. At the same time, we can see that it's very specific. So it gives us a good recipe on how to configure any sort of proxy server, and we'll see now if we could apply this sort of recipe to a GA4 configuration. So first of all, let me talk a bit about what Google has said about it, and I invite you to look at this guide. So the GA4 data controls guide that Google has shared publicly, where they've made a really good job at describing how to go step by step in order to approach the recipe ordered by the CNIL, and we can see that in this control guide, Google presents a number of data types on which you can apply specific configuration and get close to the CNIL recipes. Obviously, it's not natively configured that way. So by default, GA4 will not come with a configuration that follows all the proxy rules, but it's still possible to manipulate and configure your GA4 in order to fit all the rules there. Just take an example. So the IP address, which has received a lot of focus in the past. What about the IP address in GA4? So natively in GA4, we saw that location data is inferred from the visitor IP address. Then the IP addresses are immediately discarded after the location data is inferred, and the IP address data is never logged or stored on the analytics databases. So that's the native GA4 configuration. Now, if you want to apply a proxy setup, GA4 gives you the option to redact altogether the IP address. So the GA4 server tag allows you to redact the IP address in your server container. Obviously, if the option to redact is not selected, the IP address will automatically be masked by your GA4 server tag. So that's the native control. So we can see that every time there is a data type, Google suggests native privacy controls that Gabriel presented us, plus a number of options to go further and to respect the proxy rules. They did a really good job at basically taking every aspect of the CNIL recipe and addressing that with some sort of features. Obviously, it requires a bit of work. It's not configured by default, but it's definitely doable and an option that is worth exploring. So overall, the conclusion is that looking at GA4 configuration and settings, we have options to get to a proxy solution. Obviously, if we do that, the next logical question is, okay, this is great. What are the limitations that this sort of configuration will yield to? So that's where I think we can start discussing about trade-offs. If you do configure your GA4 according to the CNIL principles, you'll see three main limitations. First one being limited features. And there, like, we have a number of examples. So around the Google signals in particular. So what is it exactly? So all the demographics, interest data, all aspects of cross-platform reporting, remarketing, audiences, and ads personalization will be limited. So no more access to that. Second limitation is around limited analytics. So there are a number of things that you won't be able to do anymore. Obviously, like no more location data in your report, no more demographics or interest reports, no more granular location device data, and a number of issues around accuracy. So Google warns that there will be inaccuracies in the measurement of your conversions or in the attribution of the traffic sources. So definitely like a fairly big impact there. And again, a number of other limitations that can be also tricky to apprehend. The one there that is, I think, the most obvious is you will have probably more trouble in identifying spams and bots when the IP address is no longer available. So second set of limitations that will come with this sort of configuration. Last bit is about the limited connectivity with other Google solutions, which is clearly one of Google Analytics' strengths. So the idea that you would use other Google solutions jointly with your Google Analytics is going to be more challenging, and at this point in time, definitely not like easy to configure based on what Google has made available to the market. Obviously, I think we are still like Google is working really hard on all this, so we can probably expect some rapid progress on this connectivity. Google is really switching to a model where with consented data, they will run a number of models and augment your consented data with inferred data, and that could prove true for a number of their solutions, and we can expect them to really connect this sort of analytics better with the rest of their products. But at this point in time, it's clearly an important limitation that this sort of configuration will lead to. Okay, so overall, the conclusion is it's doable. If you want to apply strictly the CNIL rules, you can do that using Google Analytics 4. We have therefore like an answer to the questions we asked. Let's take a step back and look at the broader consequences and benefits of server-side tracking migration, because beside being compliant in a specific set of configuration, I think overall from I would say a governance standpoint as a company, moving to server-side tracking comes with a number of benefits outside of strictly looking at GA4, and Gabriel will discuss that now.
Yeah, thank you. So usually, we're going to take the example of GTM, Google Tag Manager. Most of the clients are working with Google Analytics and GTM, but I think this should be useful overall. So usually we are looking at client-side tagging, and we have the client-side GTM. It's like the usual GTM we are using. And now Google introduced the server-side tagging with the server-side GTM, sorry. To give you some advantages, like overall, before we talk about privacy. So the advantage of the server-side tagging is that it can improve the page load performance, because there will be less. It will minimize the JavaScript libraries. Overall, for the performance, actually, what's going to happen is that with server-side tagging, you can use a single tag to send information to different partners instead of loading many tags on the client side. It allows you to have a better control. So this is really what it's about. It's controlling your data and what you're sending to the vendors. So you have a better control over data that is sent to your vendors and different solutions. It reduces as well the impact of ad blockers. And also another important feature is that it allows you to hide or alter sensitive data. So these are just the general advantages of server-side tagging. Something that's important, so we're going to see an example of server-side tagging just a bit later. Something that's important to understand now is what is a client. So the client is something that is used in the server-side tagging. So the goal of the client is to process, transform the data, process and transform the request data, send data to the container, and package up the results and send it back to the requester. So basically, for the setup, we'll see that just a bit later. But so you will still have your client-side GTM. A tag will be fired through, like a GA tag, for instance, will be fired through this container. Then this information will be sent to the server-side container with the client that will claim the data. And at this point, you can use the data how you want. So this is why we've seen, especially for the privacy side. So it's not only about the privacy, but for the privacy, the advantages with this setup that once the client, the GA client, claim the data, you can manipulate this data. So you can update the format to make it compatible with multiple tags if you want. You can anonymize the data. You can remove some parameters that you don't want to send to your vendors. You can validate the data before you use it. You can personalize the server response, and you can enrich the data that you have, because as this will be on the server side, once the client has information, you can add extra information if you want in your request before you push the information to the vendors. Now let's have a look at the usual regular, I would say, GTM client-side tracking. So what's happening usually? So this is without server-side tagging. You have one user, so you can see on the right, with some information. You have the user agent, the IP address, the name of the event, add to cart, for instance, for GA4. You have the cookie, you have some PII data. And if you have only the client-side tagging, what will happen is that all this information are available and can be used by the partner, or the partners can access this information. They can use this information, and they can also use, so with their own library, the partners can basically collect all the data that are available on the client side. And so this can lead to fingerprinting, for instance, and they can also call third-party partners. So you can see the issue here with only the client side. All the information that are available on the client side can be used by the different tags, even if you don't really know it. On the contrary, with the GTM server side, what's going to happen is that you have control over your data and what you are sending to the different vendors. So we still have this user with all the information, the IP event and everything. So these information are still available on the client side, but what we do usually is that inside this client-side container, you don't add other partner tags. You will only have, like, for instance, your Google Analytics tag that should be on the client side. So this information is still available here. Once you have this tag, you have the GA4, for instance, tag inside the client-side container. You can select the marketing and usable data that you want to push to the server-side container. And from there, what's going to happen is that inside the server-side container, so you will have your GA4 client, which will be another tag. And once this client claims the data, you can do basically whatever you want with it. So you can, for instance, as you can see here on the example, you can remove some parameters, you can anonymize some other parameters, And more specifically, you can choose which values you want to send to which vendor. So it's not because like Google Analytics is receiving this data that the other partner needs to receive the same. So this is the main advantage of the server-side tagging. This is why we talk a lot about server-side tagging when we talk about privacy. This is again, so it goes together with the privacy controls. As we mentioned, the privacy controls are just the data privacy controls in the interface are not enough. But this, with the server-side tagging, if you follow what the CNIL, the requirement of the CNIL, with both of these, you have control over your data, and then you should be fine.
Thanks a lot, Gabriel. So we try to cover a number of aspects around the question of GA4 and compliance and business trade-offs. Hopefully that was clear and interesting. We have a bunch of questions that were asked. It's time for questions. So if you want us to go back on specific points and address specific questions, feel free to ask them in the question section. We have a question from Exp Aho. Sorry for my pronunciation, about which is basically a summary of what we discussed. How can the privacy controls offered by Google make the solution compliance? The whole point of the decisions of the European DPAs is that Google cannot be trusted since they are subject to US law, which is fundamentally incompatible with the EU legislation. I think that's well put. I think that's the overall problem that everyone is facing on the market, and that is not just about Google, it's about any US headquartered company. So think about, I don't know, your OS on your mobile device. Think about any cloud solution that you're using, any SaaS provider that you're using. Potentially, they carry the same risk as Google solution. The only thing is that Google is under the radar, so they have been subject to specific focus by data protection authorities. But overall, the situation is just unbearable. So we are completely in a situation where there is no framework that govern data transfers between the US and the EU, and that's just not sustainable. It's why last year you've seen the Biden administration and the EU Commission make good progress on a new agreement to govern these data transfers. We see that politically it's a subject that will need to move forward fast, because it puts companies in a situation that is really awkward, where I think it's counterproductive in the sense that it's damaging GDPR effectiveness to put companies in a situation that they can't really cope with. So again, I think it's a matter of risk management. There is just no solution if you plan to use any US technology, and if you start going down that road, there are many things you need to reconsider in your company. So you'll soon end up seeing that it's just not doable, and so practically the spirit of the law needs to be followed rather than the exact letter right now, because it's just putting companies in a very awkward position. Maybe Adrien, you want to also complement this answer? I took a bit of time, but
yeah, maybe not too long. Yeah, but just to add to that, there are two things to keep in mind. The first thing is GA4 compliant just because there are additional privacy controls when compared to UA? And the answer is that we cannot really answer that. Nobody really knows, but because there haven't been any decisions against GA4 or against the use of GA4 rather. But what you have to keep in mind is that GA is just a tool. The tool itself is not compliant or not compliant. It's what you're going to be how you're going to be using the tool that will be compliant or not. There's a whole thing about around your consent management, prior information. All of that makes a data processing compliant or not. Just GA itself is not going to be compliant or not. And this is why, in the very first place, several data protection authorities mentioned that Universal Analytics or Google Analytics was not compliant and that it was illegal. And then the CNIL backtracked and say, okay, you know what? We cannot say that. It's not illegal. And there are ways that you can, implement GA to make it compliant with the GDPR, even though, it might mean proxification and everything. So the answer is not privacy controls alone are going to make Google compliant, because as Romain stated, it will depend on what you're going to be doing with that data. But privacy controls offer solutions to a number of issues that were mentioned by the data protection authorities in their decisions. That's mainly it. It's additional safeguards, but at the end of the day, it's how you're going to be implementing the solution that will make it compliant or not. And it's the same thing for any single solution that you're going to be implementing on your website, on your properties. And yes, to reiterate what Romain said as well, any EU-based or US-based company rather, and especially electronic communication service providers are going to be subject to FISA, so US surveillance laws, and that means that if you're thinking in terms of Google might not be compliant, GCP potentially same thing, AWS, Microsoft Azure, Adobe Cloud, Salesforce, all of those companies that are potentially sending data over to the US, it's the same thing. So yeah, you have to keep in mind what's happening in terms of political situation on the one hand, and on the other, all of these are tools and how you as a company are going to be implementing those and making sure that these are compliant with your own policies as well as the applicable laws for your business.
Thank you, Adrien. We have another question. Do you have a good alternative to GA4 located in the EU? Anything you can recommend? Obviously, there are alternatives to GA4 located in the EU. I think the good will depend on your use cases. For instance, Didomi, we are a privacy tech company located in the EU. We are a B2B business. So the idea of removing a lot of analytics capabilities doesn't mean a lot for us, in the sense that we can live and do our job and perform correctly without Google Analytics. So the risk assessment for us is very easy. Our use cases are very limited, and we can find an alternative to Google Analytics. Now, if you're like a B2C company in any vertical, where you have a lot of marketing programs running, and where your analytics is really feeding a lot the intelligence you put in these marketing programs, the use cases are completely different, and therefore the alternatives will be different and more complex to find. Obviously, I'm sure Jellyfish can help you and guide you on this type of questions. There are also a number of Google Analytics competitors that have made a lot of publicity over the last months. I think the good way to approach this question is to think in terms of use cases, and with your use cases, you can anticipate what sort of risk you're willing to take, what the trade-offs, what are the trade-offs you're willing to take as a company. Okay. Questions from Nicolas. One point regarding proxy: with pseudonymization, we reduce the risk, yet we can still track journey, given that some customers can be linked to one user. Yes, obviously, pseudonymization is never a solution per se. It's not anonymization, and there is a big nuance there to be made. So always beware of pseudonymization, because you're still manipulating personal data afterwards. Now you're adding more security and making it more complex and costly for any company to run tracking schemes. So all depend on what you mean by pseudonymization. But you're right, it's a matter of configuration, and this configuration can be complex. We've tried to enlighten the audience today on this sort of configuration. Obviously, like if you go in details, you'll run into all sorts of questions. So that's also where a good partner to help you navigate these configurations can come handy, and so hopefully you'll find the right one. Jellyfish is a great partner. I can speak for them, having prepared this content today with them. Okay, have we missed any questions that you would like us to go through? So we are going to share the presentation and the replay if you'd like to get access to the slides. One last question. The CNIL says that hosting of a proxy has to be Schrems 2 compliant. Does it mean that I cannot host the proxy on GCP? Good question.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. Yeah, because you have to take into consideration the compliance of your server. Obviously, if you focus on the fact that sending data over to Google is the issue, not specifically Google Analytics, well, that means that hosting your server on GCP potentially doesn't solve the issue, because you're just going to have a proxy that's going to be receiving, for instance, the IP address of your user instead of GA directly. And although the GA server might not be receiving that IP address, Google, as a whole, Google is a huge entity, right? Google with GCP might still be receiving that IP address. So definitely that's something to keep in mind. But proxies do not necessarily need to be on GCP. We've had proxies on other clouds, either in the EU or in the US for several clients. So this is something that you can do, or you could even do that on a physical server that you own and that you operate.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's not just GCP. It's AWS, it's Azure, it's every US cloud providers which form the bulk of the market. So yeah, again, that's where it can become absurd, because anywhere you put US technology, you're subject to this sort of risk, and you'll see that it's not manageable. It's not realistic to remove US technologies. And I would even argue, personally, I don't think it's desirable, because we can find a better way.
And yeah, and Nika is right, saying that even if you choose a server location within Europe for GCP, AWS, Azure, and everything, they're still, they still belong to a US person, US based company, which is incidentally the reason why Google, since the first day when the privacy shield has been invalidated, has stated that they would not be creating a EU specific version of Google Analytics. First, it would be a nightmare from purely from an infrastructure point of view, but also that wouldn't solve the issue of potentially having US surveillance organizations just collect data and access data on EU soil, because that's just how the way the US surveillance law works. So should we take a look at the polls? Maybe I see.
Yes, I think it's the right time to look at the polls. And so to the first question, which was around migration, 45% have already migrated, 42% are preparing the migration, and 13% have not started the migration yet. So it's still like a massive majority who has already starting to work on it. So it's a good sign. The deadline is in July, so it's coming fast. And to the second question of the poll, are you considering switching from Google Analytics to another solution? Again, their majority, 56%, will keep using Google Analytics. So we'll go through the trade-offs we have presented today, and 34% are considering using another solution. It's still like a strong percentage. If I remember correctly, I think Google Analytics overall global market share is around 60%. So it's fairly representative of what we have there. I think in Europe, Google Analytics market share was much higher so far. So we'll maybe see a bit more competition as a result, which is always good. Then I just have, for the sake of time, to thank our speakers today. Thank you, Gabriel and Adrien, for all your this enlightening contribution. It's been a pleasure to have this webinar with you. Many thanks to all the attendees for joining, and just a teaser for the next one, which will be at the end of the month on March 30th, and we'll have a great panel again to discuss the changes that will come for the IAB transparency and consent framework. So if you're interested in this topic, feel free to join us as well. Many thanks, everyone. And again, the recording will be available on the Yes We Trust website and blog. Thank you. Have a great day, evening, and we'll see each other next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.